Hi, everyone. My name is Betsy Cooper, and I am the director of the Aspen Tech Policy Hub. I'm thrilled to be here today to release really important products from our Hub Fellows on Tech for Good. There's a huge debate around the risks and rewards of technology, and I think too often we forget that technology provides tremendous benefit in many different sectors of our lives. And so several of our fellows, Anjana Rajan and Samara Trilling, have been working on amazing projects over the past 6 months to really highlight some of the ways that technology could be used to help prevent violent extremism and to improve the fairness of our housing system. And so we're very excited to release those today in this webinar. So thank you so much for joining us. The run of show will basically serve as follows. Our fellows will each present their work, and then we're thrilled to have a keynote from Rediet Abebe, who will sort of bring together the broader themes of the talks that we've had today. A couple logistical notes. We will get to questions at the end of the program. Please use the Q&A box in order to submit any questions to us, and we will get to as many as we can towards the end. Also, we'll be releasing the products that we're talking about during this webinar. So follow along in the chat button and you'll be able to see the actual links to the projects that have been created, and you can look through them in real time. And then finally, as you probably just noticed, we're a relatively new webinar team, and there will probably be a few technical glitches along the way. So please bear with us if those do occur. So first, I'm thrilled to hand it over to Anjana Rajan, who is going to be talking to us about her work on countering violent extremism. This is a really interactive problem. It's one that, in fact, inspired me to enter policy in the first place. Anjana is the former CTO of Callisto. She's now with Polaris, and she's developed an innovative system to help witnesses report concerning behavior. So we're very excited to release this, and over to Anjana to tell us more about what she's done.
Thank you, Betsy, and thanks to all of you for spending your morning with us. My name is Anjana Rajan, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer of Polaris. We're an NGO based in Washington, D.C. that fights human trafficking and modern slavery. My expertise is applying cryptography to national security and human rights issues. And so my work at Aspen is focused on a central question, which is how can we create privacy-preserving ways to prevent mass gun violence caused by white supremacist extremists. Today, I'm going to share with you the work that I've done over the past year to address this problem. First, I want to take you back to August of last year to two extremely tragic events. First was a shooting in El Paso, Texas, and then immediately the next day, the mass shooting in Dayton, Ohio. As I often feel after horrific mass shootings, I was devastated and frankly angry at the politicians who refused to take meaningful action. They offered thoughts and prayers and said there was no way to prevent these random acts of violence. But these two mass shootings were not random, because we know that the shooter in El Paso was motivated by white supremacist ideology, and we know that the shooter in Dayton was motivated by misogyny. And so I became really invested in this problem and began reading a lot about it. And there were three seminal pieces of research that really inspired me. First, I came across a report published by the Soufan Center, a leading counterterrorism think tank. And the report described how white supremacist extremism is a transnational political movement that poses a global threat. Interestingly, the report uncovered how these networks imitate the tactics and techniques of Salafi jihadist terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And most surprisingly, white supremacist terrorism is responsible for more deaths on US soil than jihadist terrorism since 9/11. After I read this report, it was clear to me that although white supremacist ideology is not unique to the United States, the lethality caused by this problem is exacerbated in the US because of the ubiquity and unfettered access to firearms in our country. And so after I learned that the perpetrators of the mass shootings in El Paso and in Pittsburgh and in Charleston and so many others were motivated by white supremacist ideology, I became interested in looking at mass shootings from a counterterrorism lens. This led me to the second piece of important research that I found, a gun violence study conducted by the FBI that looked at the pre-attack behaviors of active shooters between 2000 and 2013. The most interesting insight from that study was that each perpetrator had, on average, 3 distinct witnesses who observed concerning behaviors prior to the attack. Some of these behaviors were quite severe, including the killer explicitly communicating an intention to cause mass harm. Unfortunately, nearly 60% of those witnesses did not report to the police, and their reason for not reporting included distrust of the police, loyalty to the perpetrator, the self-doubt of one's assessment of the risk, and a desire to remain anonymous. This meant that an opportunity for intervention was missed and lives were lost. The final piece of research that influenced me was a report from Everytown for Gun Safety, which shows that the majority of mass shootings involved domestic violence. Specifically, 54% of all mass shootings involve the perpetrator killing a family member or intimate partner in the attack. Research also shows that misogyny, or extreme hatred of women, is a common factor that underpins many terrorist ideologies and political violence, including white supremacist extremism. Therefore, one could argue that domestic violence is a force multiplier for violent extremism and should be treated with the federal resources it deserves. And more importantly, domestic violence survivors should be empowered to play a pivotal role in preventing mass gun violence caused by white supremacist extremists. The theory of change that I'm proposing is, if we can address this low reporting rate of witnesses, especially among vulnerable populations, we could intervene appropriately before a mass shooting occurs and save lives. I have solved a very similar problem before, but in a different space. Before I came to Aspen, I was a CTO of a tech startup called Callisto, and we focused on the low reporting rates of sexual assault survivors on college campuses. And the reason survivors don't report sounds very familiar to me: distrust of the police, loyalty to the perpetrator, the self-doubt of one's experience, and a desire to remain anonymous. We saw this low reporting rate as a game theory problem, namely that there's a first mover disadvantage for coming forward by yourself, but if you can learn you're not the only one, you're more likely to take action. So we created a product called a cryptographic information escrow. A victim can create a time-stamped encrypted record of the assault, and nobody, not even Callisto, could see that data unless a second victim names the same perpetrator. If there was a match, the 2 victims are connected to a lawyer who will help them navigate all of their reporting options, ranging from taking legal action to pursuing restorative justice to everything in between. And the product works. Callisto users are 6 times more likely to report, they report 3 times faster, and we were able to detect serial perpetrators that would have otherwise not been reported to the police. And so I asked myself, how could a similar privacy-preserving technology be applied to this national security problem? Here's how I envision it could work. The first witness creates an encrypted record about the suspect and enters this into the reporting escrow. That report stays encrypted so that nobody, not even the escrow provider, can see this data unless another witness creates a record about the same suspect. The first witness can unlock the escrow independently if the observed behaviors are severe enough. The escrow is unlocked when a threshold of concerning behaviors are observed by 1 or more people. This creates a low-risk environment for the witness to report because nobody can see this accusation unless a credible threshold of risk is met. The records are decrypted by a legal counselor, who is an attorney, who provides free confidential counseling to the witness about the reporting options. The legal counselor provides 2 firewalls. First, as a lawyer, they can establish attorney-client privilege and protect these conversations against a subpoena. And second, they can filter out false accusations by malicious actors before they become escalated to law enforcement. The counselor can then explain the variety of calibrated reporting options a witness can take, such as filing for a red flag law petition to remove the suspect's weapons, enrolling the suspect in a therapeutic program, or another non-law enforcement intervention. Applying this technical innovation poses several policy questions, which became the crux of my project at Aspen. First, we need to clearly define what the threshold of risk is. This is a challenging problem because you want to both identify potential violence while not infringing on citizen civil liberties. I wrote a technical white paper that outlines the details of this risk model that would power the engine of this escrow. Second, when you're building products for a vulnerable population, such as domestic violence survivors, it is important to understand that their needs are unique in a moment of crisis. I created a trauma-informed design framework to show how an escrow for this particular population should be deployed. Third, this model requires calibration with real data. I created a series of real-life case studies to run through the risk model to see where the edge cases might require tweaking. And finally, I built a demo app of this risk model to show how the escrow could be powered. You can test it out yourself at thewitnessapp.org. This project intersects with so many multidisciplinary areas: counterterrorism, gun control, domestic violence, privacy and civil liberties, behavioral health, and cryptography. And so a major focus of my time at Aspen was learning from these experts in these fields. Here are some of the informational interviews with subject matter experts I had during my fellowship that informed the details of my solution. I particularly want to thank a few people. First, Colin Clark from the Soufan Center was my advisor during this fellowship, and he so generously supported my work. And I want to thank 2 Aspen fellows who joined me on this project, Samara Trilling and Jessica Cole. I'd like to leave you with some concluding thoughts. The events of 2020 underscore the fact that mass gun violence caused by white supremacist terrorists continues to be an urgent crisis that requires a multidisciplinary approach. In the last 6 months alone, we have seen the following trends. We've seen white supremacist terrorist groups threaten to use the coronavirus as a bioweapon. We've seen spikes in gun sales. We've seen that domestic violence has increased significantly. And we've seen that the public's trust in law enforcement has drastically declined as police brutality and systemic racism persist. There is an opportunity amidst the chaos of this current moment to reimagine what public safety can look like. We can develop solutions that protects our communities from violent extremism, and that protect civil rights and civil liberties, and that create compassionate and calibrated de-escalation channels that go beyond a traditional law enforcement response. My hope is that this proposal can excite policymakers, law enforcement, and activists alike. We don't need to choose between national security and civil liberties. We can and we must build for both. Thank you. Back to you, Betsy.
Thanks so much, Anjana. That was tremendous, and I think is highlighting a really important space, which is the importance of engaging with witnesses and giving them ways that they feel comfortable to report in these really sensitive situations. I want to remind the audience that we can take questions at any time, so use the Q&A box to ask any questions for Anjana, and we'll get to those later in the program. Also, we've officially released her project, and so you can now visit it. If you check out the chat window, you'll be able to see the information about her project. So switching gears, we have a housing crisis in America, and that housing crisis has only gotten worse in light of the pandemic that we're all experiencing due to COVID-19. Samara Trilling, who's a software engineer at Sidewalk Labs, has really innovative ideas for how to improve the mortgage lending system, and that was the focus of her project while she was here at the Hub. We're very excited to release this work today. So Samara, over to you to take us through the amazing stuff that you've built.
Great. Thank you so much, Betsy. I'm Samara Trilling, and I'm a software engineer with a focus on engineering for social justice and fairness. Anjana brilliantly articulated how in 2020, discrimination and white supremacy show up in so many insidious ways, but that we can craft technology to help detect and protect people from white supremacist violence. I'm going to talk about how discrimination shows up in the financial systems and technologies we already have, and how we can turn those technologies to our benefit and make them fight on our behalf for fairness and justice. But first, my journey to this project researching housing loans starts in a pretty predictable place with a house. So my family never owned our house when I was growing up, and I've always wanted to own my own home. Like most people, I never thought much about mortgages and how they work until I started getting curious about what it would take to buy a home. So I started doing research about mortgages, and I found a really puzzling statistic. It turns out that women are charged higher interest rates for mortgages, but we pay them back at higher rates than our counterparts. To me, this mismatch seems pretty unfair. For banks, it's a great deal. They can charge women higher interest rates and will still pay back the mortgage. And this is not just true for women. People with thin credit history and people who live in areas where there aren't as many financial services options also get charged higher rates. And people of color are disproportionately represented in both of those groups. So women of color often get hit doubly hard by these policies. And it turns out the reason why women are charged higher interest rates is partially because of another unfair thing, the gender pay gap. Women make lower incomes on average, and lenders use your income as a data point to help predict whether you'll default on or not pay back your mortgage. So on average, women have lower incomes, and therefore, on average, we get higher interest rates. This brings me to the first problem that I wanted to solve. Income may be an okay predictor of mortgage default for men, but it's a bad predictor of default for women. And what we're seeing here is differential validity. Differential validity means there are variables that work well to predict default for some groups, but they don't predict as well for other groups. And currently, fair lending audits don't catch this problem. Currently, a fair lending audit looks something like this. A fair lending auditor goes to a bank and asks for all of their records. They'll look to see if there's a different number of loans being given to different demographic groups. If so, they'll check to see if that's explainable by underlying differences in creditworthiness between those demographic groups. And if not, they'll ask the bank to explain itself, and if the explanation is not satisfactory, maybe take regulatory action. In this case, a difference in income is considered a legitimate difference in creditworthiness, so here's where our current audits would give the green light to a lender that charges women more on average, even if they pay back loans more reliably. In order to address differential validity, we need a new fairness metric that measures how well the lending model works for each group. Equal opportunity is one such fairness definition. It says that your false negative rate, the number of people who you incorrectly charge a higher price, must be the same for protected and unprotected groups. That's for women and men. That means that if women are being charged higher rates but are paying mortgages back more reliably, that's an error this fairness definition would catch. But let's go back to that piece of the fair lending audit process I just described, the part that requires a human, an auditor, to actually go to a bank, ask to see their records, talk to the mortgage lending officers, and do an analysis. This brings me to my second problem. Increasingly, machines, and often machine learning models, are making these mortgage decisions. And so that old way of auditing, of going to the bank and asking mortgage lenders to explain why there are differences in rates mortgages are granted to different groups, isn't going to work anymore. Furthermore, machine learning models can change really fast. You can push updates to them on a normal software engineering schedule, once a week or even once a day. Even if you wanted to be able to do a test for differential validity and recommend fixes for it, it might take too long. Traditional audits are done on a yearly basis, and these models can change weekly or daily. Now at this point, you might say, that's enough for me. Let's not allow machine learning models to make these decisions at all. But there's actually some good news about using machine learning models for mortgage decisions. First of all, a 2019 Berkeley study found that ML models can discriminate up to 40% less than human loan officers do. So there's potential to make gains in fairness by using machine learning models. And second, you can test models before you let them out into the wild. If you ask a machine learning lending model what it would do if it saw a particular customer, it will give you an honest and accurate answer. And that means you can have more confidence in the decisions your model makes. And that brings me to my second solution. In order to have capacity to evaluate algorithms that change frequently, state banking regulators should automate fair lending testing. I'm proposing a lightweight, immediate fairness test to certify machine learning lending models before they're allowed to make real mortgage decisions. Lightweight means it takes less than 10 minutes to run. Immediate means that a regulator could run this on a bank's model every time it changes before it's allowed to start making mortgage decisions in the wild. This test would satisfy fair lending law and use that new fairness definition we were talking about to improve on existing fairness standards. And this would report the results of the test every time it runs to the bank and to the regulator so they can take action to fix it if the latest model is not up to snuff. Here's how it would work. The regulator has a test data set where it knows the right answers. It knows which of the historical applicants paid back their loans and which ones didn't. It sends that hypothetical applicant information to the bank model. The bank model sends back whether it would give each applicant a loan and at what price. Then the fairness test would check how many errors the bank model made and, crucially, whether the bank model made more errors for certain demographic groups than others. That's the fairness definition at work. But we wouldn't want to implement this without understanding all the edge cases. So I propose that we pilot both the new fairness definition and this lightweight immediate fairness test with a fair machine learning lending contest in partnership with the university's data science program. Students and teams from industry can develop their own lending models that try to optimize for this new definition of fairness. Those models would be checked by the lightweight immediate fairness test. The team whose model is the fairest get the prize, but the real value goes to the regulators. Once all the entries are submitted, the regulators can look at the decisions the fairest models are making and decide if the current fairness definition is actually claiming the people it wants to help. During my fellowship, I produced a policy memo outlining how to select a new fairness definition and build a lightweight immediate fairness test, along with a sample set of machine learning lending contest rules. Finally, it can be difficult to sort through the pros and cons of different types of statistical fairness definitions, and while equal opportunity may work best for mortgage lending, different ones work better for different situations. I produced a flowchart to help regulators and government officials decide which type of fairness would best fit their goals, and a cheat sheet to help keep the pros and cons of each definition handy. A lot of work went into developing and honing these ideas, much of it not mine. I want to thank Matthew Homer, Seema Shah, and Winston Berkman-Bream from the New York Department of Financial Services, our own state banking regulator, for hearing these ideas and immediately being excited about how to work with me on implementing them for New York State. And a special thank you to my Aspen fellow collaborator, Madison Jacobs, for your hard work with me on this project. So in 2020, we're facing a pandemic that has cost many people their jobs and often their ability to repay their mortgage. And this isn't affecting all of us equally. This crisis is hitting those of us who are freelancers, gig economy workers, and small business owners the hardest. If we don't take this moment to define and enforce the fairness of the models making decisions about future borrowers' mortgages, these models could learn from this crisis to never give a mortgage to a freelancer, a restaurant worker, or a small business owner. They would punish prospective borrowers in the future for looking like someone who defaulted on a loan through no fault of their own due to the pandemic. This is the perfect time for state banking regulators to take action and put in place guardrails so that future algorithms stop making mistakes that perpetuate long-standing injustices. And even more radically, so the algorithms start working on our behalf to fight those injustices and stand up for first-time homebuyers getting a fair deal. Thank you so much. Back to you, Betsy.
Thanks so much, Samara. And, you know, we really focus here at the Hub on practical solutions. And so I'm thrilled to see such a practical set of ideas being put out to solve a really intractable problem in the housing space. So for those of you joining us, I hope many of you, especially those who represent states and other places, will take the time to, you know, take this on and to help us get this information out there. So we really appreciate that. So in terms of Q&A, we just want to remind you to use the Q&A button on your screen in order to be able to ask questions of Samara, of Anjana, and of all of our team here. And also to check out the products that Samara has released today, so you can see those below. So with that, I'm thrilled to introduce our keynote speaker for the day, Rediet Abebe. She's a computer scientist who focuses on algorithms and artificial intelligence. She's coming from my alma mater, Cornell, and will be joining where I used to work at UC Berkeley, Go Bears, in the fall. So we can't wait to have you out in the Bay Area, and hopefully, if the pandemic permits, to meet us all in person. She's going to be providing some unique, broader context to our conversation. Thank you to the people who are saying "Go Big Red." She's going to be providing further conversation, so we're very excited to understand the limits of fair algorithms and to think about that in the context of these projects. So Rediet, over to you.
Thank you so much, Betsy. Before I get started, can I just confirm that you can see my slides and everything? We were having technical issues earlier.
We can indeed.
You can, very good. Okay, all right, we can get started then. Thank you so much for this very kind invitation to join you during this day. And thank you to the two fellows for this incredible work that you've been doing to ensure that algorithms can protect and defend especially vulnerable communities now and also going forward. Today, what I'll do is I'll use our time together to reflect on some of what was talked about, and especially Samara's work on fair lending. And I'll then zoom out to reflect on what roles, if any, computing can play in combating injustice and inequity. So reflecting on Samara Trilling's presentation on fair algorithmic housing loans, in this work, Samara tackles an important problem in housing, which is mortgage lending, which is becoming increasingly more and more important. And it's increasingly also using machine learning algorithms for making loan approvals and pricing decisions. And as Samara pointed out, left unregulated, these machine learning models have the potential to disproportionately discriminate against vulnerable populations, including unbanked borrowers, women, LGBTQ individuals, Black individuals, and really many, many groups of individuals that are quite vulnerable. And as it stands, a lot of algorithms that are being used are very black box. We don't necessarily know what data is going into them, what features they're using, how the current laws apply to them, and whether we're even ensuring protection from discrimination for every protected group, and especially individuals at the intersection of different protected groups. And this is not just a mortgage lending problem. This is a wider affordable housing problem in the United States. In many US cities, we know that a lot of individuals, many households are becoming more and more rent burdened. This is becoming even worse with the pandemic. But even setting aside the pandemic, the number of households that are rent burdened has doubled since the 1960s. And algorithms are being used not just for mortgage loans, but also for tenant screening and renting decisions, advertising housing opportunities to individuals. And there's even evidence that algorithmic tools may be driving up housing costs, both for renting and buying, and maybe driving up eviction rates. At the same time, this is coupled with increased deregulation of algorithms in this space. A 2019 proposal by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, it put forth a proposal that would effectively prevent tenants from suing landlords if they suspect that the landlords may be discriminating against them in cases where landlords were using algorithms. So this is a situation where if a landlord was discriminating against you, but they weren't using an algorithm, you would be able to sue them. But if they were using an algorithm and you suspect the algorithm is discriminating against you, then that would significantly decrease your ability to stand up for yourself and those with similar backgrounds as you. So here we were thinking about how we can create algorithms that are more fair. And by fair, we oftentimes are looking to statistical definitions that often involve treating individuals of the same merit, and we get to define what we mean by merit here, but individuals that have the same merit ought to be treated equally by the algorithm, regardless of what group they belong in, right? So if you're thinking about, let's say, Samara's example of when you're giving out loans, you want to make sure that people are not going to default on their loans. The definition of merit here is the chances of you defaulting on your loans. And Samara's example mentions that women are actually less likely to default on these loans, so maybe they have higher merit, but in fact are not being treated the same as people of other genders, that they might be actually being discriminated against these algorithms, right? So a statistical definition here could say that you want to treat individuals that are of the same merit equally, and you get to define what you mean by equally and what you're exactly that you're looking at. But there are many challenges here to achieving this, right? There's the availability of data, how you get to define what merit means, how it might actually kind of play out in practice. I won't get into any of these, but I do want to step back and say, what are the limits of fair algorithms, and share with you some recent work I've put forth with my collaborator, Max Casey, that draws on theories of justice to identify 3 key limitations. So the first limitation here is that these algorithms, if we rely on statistical definitions of fairness, a lot of times they might legitimize and perpetuate inequality justified by merit. That is, if you think that someone is likely to default on their loans and you actually were able to accurately predict this, or if you think that someone is likely to not pay their rent, then it says it is fair and it is okay for you to not give that person a loan, or it is fair, or it's okay for you to not give that person housing opportunities. And really, we ought to step back and think about whether we think that's something that we would stand by, that this kind of framework that reinforces rather than questions the legitimacy of the status quo, whether that's something that we have an opportunity to actually question and try to undermine. The second limitation is that a lot of times when we discuss algorithms, we discuss them in a very narrowly bracketed way. We think about what's happening within the algorithm. We say someone is coming in front of a landlord or a bank, and they want to get a loan or they want to get housing, and we ask, can we treat them fairly or equally in this particular context? But it's important to take the broader context into perspective. We can have algorithms that might be treating individuals unequally in the context of this very narrowly bracketed definition, but actually might lead to greater equality in society, right? So we can take individuals that have been discriminated against or disenfranchised or underserved historically and actually use this framework as an opportunity to undo some of those injustices and lead to a society that is more equal than what we currently have. And the third limitation of algorithmic fairness, or these fairness-based perspectives, is that oftentimes they focus on what's happening between groups. We say, you know, if you have men versus women, or if you have individuals who are Black versus individuals who are of other races, are we leading to unequal treatment between these groups? But we also know that what's happening within the groups matters. So if you're taking, for instance, an intersectional perspective, we know that there are women from women who are Black, women who are low income, women who are immigrant, women who are undocumented immigrants. There are all these different groups. And we know that individuals that are at these intersections of vulnerable communities tend to be significantly more vulnerable than those who are not. And so a fairness-based perspective might miss what happens when you sort of disaggregate groups in this way, and that you might have equal treatment across groups that's actually consistent with very significant inequality within groups. So I raise these 3 limitations as a sort of caution. And if you step back, actually, there's been a lot of discussion on the dangers of using computing for social good or for social justice. There's concerns about solutionism, that is this tendency to assume that computing can solve social problems. There's concerns about tinkering, that a lot of our solutions tend to be working sort of on the edges of problems rather than taking the status quo putting the status quo under the spotlight and not taking it for granted. And a lot of times there's also a tendency to use computing as a way to kind of distract from broader concerns, and that maybe concern on sort of how we can precisely define certain things can take oxygen away from different conversations that we might have. So what's going on here? Now you might walk away from this thinking that maybe we should just kind of throw out algorithms and try to do something else that might be resolving inequity or injustices. But that's where a sort of a multidisciplinary perspective and a multi-stakeholder perspective comes in. Social change that we would like to see is the work of many hands. This includes folks in machine learning and computer science more generally. It involves communities, it involves legal scholars, it involves activists, it involves a wide range of people than ones that have been taken into account in the progress that we would like to make. So how do you cut a path between what we see as the real promises and potential of computing for social good while keeping in mind these critiques that I've mentioned, including some of my own work, but the work of many others as well, and also acknowledging other forms of solutions that can help address broader societal problems. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to be able to get into each of these in detail, but I do want to highlight work that I did with my colleagues back at Cornell, where we looked through a lot of the results from the computing community that we've really liked, and we looked at different categories that they can belong in order to advance social change. So we identified 4 categories that computing can serve as a diagnostic to measure to measure how social problems manifest technically and the extent of these problems. It can serve as a formalizer by helping us shape how we understand these problems and what we're trying to solve. And in a way, it can give you a site for having a lot of political discussions that might be difficult to have otherwise. It can clarify its own limits. Computing is very good at saying you can achieve this, or actually here are some impossibility results that say you cannot get this and this other thing. And it can also draw attention to old problems and in that way serving as a synecdoche. So just to give you 2 examples of these, you may be aware of the work by Safia Noble and her book on algorithms of oppression that discusses how search engines have been a site for a lot of discrimination and unequal treatment. So if you look at her cover, it has a sample that says, "Why are Black women so?" and then there's an autofill. And the examples that you see are, why are Black women so angry, so loud, so mean, so attractive, so lazy, so annoying, so confident, so sassy, so insecure. And this is just one example of many where algorithms learn from historic discrimination or conversations that we're having, and they replicate that. And so in a way, computing has actually served as a way to measure the extent of these problems, to diagnose them. So you might think of facial recognition as being an example. And the second is as a rebuttal. So you might have heard of an extreme vetting initiative that was under consideration in 2018, where ICE wanted to use automated social media screening and other data sources to identify which immigrants are likely to be more productive members of society. And what came out of that was a group of computing scholars and other folks came together to write a pushback against this, to say, look, there is no algorithm that can do that thing that you're trying to do. And so this initiative, as a result of a lot of pushback, was scrapped and it did not take hold. So these are just 2 examples of the many forms that computing can take to fight against injustice and inequity in conjunction with other disciplines and community members and domain experts. So in my work, I focused on this sort of triangle. On the left-hand side, you have the sort of techniques and methods. I'm a computer scientist. A lot of my contributions tend to be technical contributions within computer science. but I always do that in conjunction with domain experts, right? So if we're thinking about housing, as Samara has done, you can work with the New York, Commission on Human Rights, or the Department of Housing in New York, or really any set of domain experts that can clarify for you what's actually achievable, what are they trying to get at, and what is an actual limitation on the ground that you might not necessarily be aware of. But the most important of these is people and communities. A lot of times, the people who are in power, whether it's scholars or those who are implementing policy, tend to not reflect our society at large. And so, in my work, I've worked to advance not just the role of computing in social change, but also the role of computing scholars in social change, and in particular, making sure that computing looks and reflects the society that we want to see. So one work that we've done is through Black in AI, which has increased the representation and inclusion of Black individuals in the field of artificial intelligence. And really tying all of this together is the Mechanism Designed for Social Good initiative, which works to make sure that that we're not only representatives of society and of many different domain experts, but also ways of knowing and thinking and advancing social justice and equity in the problems that we see around us. And with that, I'll conclude. I'll encourage you all to go to md4sg.com if you'd like to learn more, and I look forward to hearing more from you all. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate getting the chance to learn more about your work and all the amazing things that relate to this field. And so we're going to turn to question and answer. So I'm going to ask Avi to bring up all the panelists so that we can all have a conversation. And so we're just going to invite you all, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you're able to, please also give your affiliation, and that would be really helpful as well, so that we can share who is asking the questions. So the first question I'd like to ask is to Rediet. So if we could bring her video up, that'd be great. So what should policymakers know about how algorithmic fairness works? If you had to give the bumper sticker for policymakers, what's the biggest misconception that you think people have about AI and bias? Oh, I think you're still on mute. Nope, still on mute.
How about now?
Yes.
We're good. All right, there you go. Okay, question was, what do policymakers need to know about the limitations of algorithmic fairness, or what are the biggest misconceptions? There are really so many. I think I would say that the biggest caution I would give is that the answers are going to come from the computing or algorithmic community. It's not going to come from any single community, and certainly not from just algorithms. There's no one definition that's going to do what we want it to do. There's no set of steps that you can follow that's going to ensure that you have not discriminated against anyone. It really is, there's really no kind of silver bullet here that the computing and algorithmic and machine learning community has to provide. So I would say that it's important to make sure that we understand the limitations of all of these disciplines that are really coming at play, and to try to figure out a way to complement our strengths and sort of maybe mitigate our weaknesses to come up with more holistic solutions.
Fantastic, thank you. And so, Anjana, I want to turn to you. So it seems we have a question from Adele Burns, and she asks, it seems like a real challenge to get this witness app into the hands of the right people. Luckily, you actually have engaged with this before in your past work with Callisto. So what solutions to this type of problem have you seen, either from that past experience or in the research that you've been doing more broadly?
Yeah, this is a really important question. It's not lost on me that as we think about protecting ourselves against potential terrorists, we also have to worry about community policing gone wrong. And so one of my fears when I was designing the solution was, how do we protect against vigilantism? And this was just underscored for me in the last few months with the murder of Ahmaud Arbery and so much of the police brutality that we're seeing right now. And so just like what I saw in the sexual assault space, to me, this isn't a tool that we can carelessly deploy to the public. And so as I worked on this project, I asked myself, what criteria should be met for a witness to be able to access this very powerful tool? And to me, it was 2 criteria. First, a witness needs to have demonstrated that they've seen an act of violence and demonstrate that they've seen hateful ideologies. And that's why domestic violence was, and domestic violence shelters and hotlines felt like a really strong deployment mechanism, because by definition, particularly if the victim is a woman experiencing violence from a man, that means by definition they have been exposed to a hateful ideology, which is misogyny, and that they've hit a level where the violence has become unmanageable and they're seeking help. And so ultimately, I think it's just so imperative to think about these types of problems with a systems approach, because it's not just about the bad actor, it's actually understanding, the institutional levers that exist, that we can start thinking about public safety in a really careful and nuanced way.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Matthew Zhou, who is a machine learning lead at Village MD, and he asks to Samara, given that audits and compliance are familiar tools in financial spaces, what other industries do you think might be good candidates for introducing these kinds of fairness audits? So essentially, if you were to go to another industry after this one, where would you be looking?
Yeah, this is a great question. The real beauty of having, as Rediet was saying, a definition that you can tailor to any specific situation that you're looking at. As I said, maybe there's one that works well for this particular instance of mortgage lending, but you want something different for life insurance, say. Anything where you're trying to predict an objective outcome. So in life insurance, it's somebody's lifespan. You can look at whether somebody will pay their rent. That is an objective outcome. Something that's not subjective, like trying to predict. I think if you try to predict something like job performance, that's very subjective. You get into really, it's very easy to reinforce and to create new existing biases, reinforce existing and create new ones. And so, yeah, I think that you can absolutely use this fairness definition and automated test to test your definition of fairness, and also to implement something that will work for a very narrow specific case.
Great, thank you. The next question's for the whole group. It's from Chauncey Arnold. So Chauncey's asking, how can normal people get involved in helping in the areas that you all are working on, whether they're involved in policy or not? How can you help bring these tools and insights into practice today, since the necessity is so urgent in this moment? Do you have any ideas for strategies that you feel would be more helpful than others? So feel free to jump in.
One of the interesting things that I learned actually in my research on algorithms in mortgages was that the people who get the best rates on mortgages are people who shop around, right, and have multiple different offers. That's something that you don't have to be a machine learning scientist or computer scientist to do. And having that sort of, as Rediet was saying, sort of community engagement, letting more people know about that, helping other folks who you think may not have access to that information to kind of spread that. That's one example of how I think communities can disseminate information that will make, give people information about how to work the system that is currently unjust.
Any other thoughts? Oh, Rediet, I think your mute is still stuck again. I don't know why that keeps happening.
I think I have to it's working now, right?
Yeah,
I think it's
good.
double muted, that's why. Okay, it's fine, it's fine. It's, it's like a rite of passage. If you do a computer science degree, you have to be like very incompetent at technology. It's an important rite of passage. But I'll say that, one of the most exciting things about being at the sort of research interface that I'm at is that there's many, many, many people who are really excited about the fact that our work is so directly applicable, right? Our papers appear in tools, like you see your paper cited in some sort of tool that's been developed and and kind of launched it out into the world. And that is really, it's scary, it's a huge responsibility, but it's also this huge opportunity to actually make our work accessible and to translate it to a broad range of contexts. So there's a lot of people from my research community that write white papers, right? In addition to just sort of our technical papers that are meant to be more internal. There are a lot of folks that write op-eds and other pieces. There are people who just make YouTube videos and make them accessible. There are a lot of people writing books and chapters and books. And so there's really a lot of effort to make our work, there's like games and demos that you could look at. There's all sorts of things, right? So there's really a lot of people trying to make our work as accessible to as many people as possible. And there's a lot of work that has to be done here. If you're thinking about, let's say, individuals that tend to not have a lot of digital access, they don't necessarily have computers or phones, they don't necessarily know exactly the dangers that may be impacting them or the opportunities. So there's really this huge opportunity to do wide education engagement. So I would say that if you're curious to learn more, there's a lot of opportunities to learn more about our field. And if you're able to help kind of distribute that knowledge to even more removed communities from computer science and from algorithms, that would be immensely useful.
Fantastic. So the next question goes to Anjana. So could you talk a little bit about why you chose to focus on domestic terrorism rather than all forms of organized violent extremism? And how does that affect your proposals to policymakers?
Yeah, I think part of the beauty of the solution is that it scales. And so you're absolutely right. It can address many forms of many types of witnesses who want to prevent many forms of violence caused by many forms of extremism. When I thought about how I wanted to use this time at Aspen to not only bring awareness to the power of cryptography and cryptographic escrows to this problem, I also wanted to use this as a chance to draw attention to 3 other problems that were really important to me. And so the first one is why I chose to focus on white supremacist extremism. When I looked at this, this area and compared it to jihadist terrorism, it was uncanny how similar these 2 types of extremism are. The way they use technology is the same. The way they radicalize and recruit are the same. The way that they use violence to push a political agenda is the same. The way they go into these real world war zones in Ukraine and Syria are the same, and on and on. But the way we prosecute these crimes in the United States is day and night. And to me, that was a massive policy failure that I wanted to draw a lot of attention to and change the way we talk about this problem from a domestic terrorist extremism from domestic extremism to an actual counterterrorism problem. That also expands to why I chose mass shootings rather than gun violence as a whole, because we know that mass shooting is just a small part of the gun violence epidemic. But again, the takeaway I wanted people to come out of this was like the a priori conclusion that if we can reduce the footprint of weapons in the United States, we can then also decrease the lethality density of these terrorist attacks because terrorists don't have access to weapons. And so when we look at these solutions that we know to work, like red flag laws, how can we start reframing them from being just a gun violence policy, but to becoming really effective counterterrorism tactics as well? And then finally, the reason I focus on domestic violence, in addition to what I said earlier, is it was mind-blowing to me to see that how obvious a leading indicator it is of mass violence. And so while I wouldn't argue that domestic violence is a form of terrorism because there isn't a political ideology underpinning it, I would argue that misogyny is a hateful ideology. And when that manifests as gun violence, we should call that what it is, which is violent extremism. And therefore we should resource and approach it with the federal attention it deserves rather than relegating it to social justice work. And so for me, the reason I felt this was really urgent to highlight was not only is it a human rights imperative, it is also a really good national security strategy as well. And I wanted to use this platform to highlight that in addition to the technology.
Awesome, thank you. So let me ask a question to both Samara and Anjana. So the commenter says, you both found such elegant solutions to problems that you've made very clear to us today, which begs the question, what do you think has prevented policymakers from envisioning these types of solutions before? And what recommendations would you make to policymakers now in order to go forward with your topics?
So, I mean, I think one of the first answer here is just sort of the raison d'etre for the Aspen Tech Policy Hub. We need a lot more people who have experience in technology working in government roles. And that's, you know, I think that my sort of idea for automating fair lending tests came from my own experience working with continuous integration as a computer scientist, as a software engineer, which is the system that runs a test every time you push new code to make sure that you're not breaking something. And so I think that more experience from technologists in government is major. I also think that often there's the expectation that technology is going to be too expensive or is going to take too long to implement. And I think that, you know, as Rediet was saying, we sort of, I think as technology moves forward, you have a lot more, and tooling moves forward, computer scientists can create tools that will help implement these types of things much faster and with even much less technical background than previously. I think that's a big way that I think maybe that's sort of a formalizer way of using technology to make it easier for people who don't have to go to school for computer science to be able to implement these types of tests.
Awesome. Anjana, anything to add on that one?
I think it just highlights that many of these problems are multidisciplinary, and we've seen similarly shaped problems in different places. And so I think the best way to move forward is when you see a systemic problem in one area, can we start taking those solutions and bringing them into newer problems? And so my advice is just to, again, like be curious and look at the research that's been done and build off of that and bring it to life.
So we're almost out of time, so I want to ask one final question to the panel. So I'm going to go down the line for this. What is the bumper sticker that you wish the audience would take away? So give us a short, pithy, like what should the audience be remembering when they leave today? And I'll just go across the screen. So Anjana, you're up first.
I think we're looking at a really challenging political climate we're in right now with everything that's happened in 2020. And I think it's going to require us to reimagine the status quo. And so as we think about the way we define terrorism, the way we think about empowering survivors, the way we think about policing, I want us to really use this as a framework to be creative and rebuild the world we want to see.
Awesome. A little long for the back of a car, but we'll work with it. Samara, what about you?
I'd say that the status quo is not working for lending analysis and for fair lending. And we have the opportunity to make that much better with something that traditionally we're not super sure is going to help, which in this case is machine learning models, but that actually may be our path toward the future in this case.
I think you both have Range Rovers. It's pretty clear to fit these bumper stickers. Rediet, what about you?
Oh, it's unmuted. Oh, all right. Can you hear me? You can. Okay, very good. I think reimagine the status quo is what I would say as well. And I'll just add longer bumper sticker that the solution is not going to come from any one discipline or any one group of people.
Fantastic. Well, that's a wonderful note on which to end. I want to thank our amazing panelists. Congratulations to Anjana and Samara. Thank you so much for Rediet for joining us today. We are extremely excited about the products that we've released today, and so we hope that you'll take the time to go and check them out on our website, www.aspentechpolicyhub.org. Thanks to the amazing team from AV to the Aspen Digital team that's been supporting us today, to our fab intern Maddie, who's been curating all the questions. We really appreciate everyone's help today. And then we also want to remind you that we have a really important seminar coming up next. It's on the relationship between anti-racism and tech. It'll occur exactly 2 weeks from now. So we really urge you to go sign up and register to join us for that important conversation where we'll be releasing 3 sets of products related to the anti-racism and tech space. So from all of us at the Aspen Tech Policy Hub, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Thanks again.